Ephesus was the largest metropolitan city in Asia Minor in the 1st century. Considered to be a main center of occult and ancient pagan rituals, the great Artemis of Ephesus, goddess of fertility, was worshipped there. At the outset of Christianity, Apostle Paul arrived in Ephesus to preach the gospel and succeeded in jarring cultural and religious conventions. 40 years later, in his latter years, John the Apostle returned from exile on Patmos. He settled in Ephesus and shared the book of Revelation with the 7 churches named in the book. My investigation in Ephesus will enable me to follow the trail of the apostles who had such a huge impact on this city in the 1st century. The letter to the church in Ephesus begins with encouragement. I know your deeds, your hard work, and your perseverance. You have endured hardships for my name and have not grown weary.
We know that the Ephesian church was resisting false teaching. We see this in Paul's letters. There was a lot of heretical teaching about practices that he's combating there.
The text is very complimentary to this church. She has perseverance and discernment, she has sustained, she is able to discern false apostles.
But the text goes on to be highly critical. Yet I hold this against you. You have forsaken the love you had at first. The church has braved hostility, even suffered for Christ. But at the time of the book of Revelation, Christ reprimands it for having lost its first love of him. What a very mysterious paradox. What opposition did the church face in its early days? What happened when Paul preached the gospel in Ephesus? And above all, what is this loss of love referred to in the Revelation all about? After leaving the island of Patmos in the Aegean Sea, I reached Turkey. I have a stopover on the coast of Kuşadası, and then go on to the ancient site of the city of Ephesus, a few miles inland. Ephesus was once a large, thriving city on the coast of the Roman province of Asia Minor. The sea used to reach as far as the port via a canal that is now blocked. That is how Ephesus had such influence across the Aegean Sea.
It was at the end of an important road that ran across southern Asia Minor that would travel all the way to Tarsus and Antioch on the Orontes. So this road brought many travelers, much commerce from inland Asia Minor to the port of Ephesus.
Today, the beauty of the ancient site of Ephesus is a clear indication of the grandeur and opulence it enjoyed at its peak. Since 2015, it has been classified as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is considered to be the largest archaeological site in the Mediterranean basin. In the 1st century, this city was the focal point of the Roman province of Asia, a cultural, commercial, and spiritual hub buzzing with activity. Huge numbers of ships docked in the harbor, bringing merchandise from across the whole Roman Empire.
The harbor there was a great commercial center. From the lower city in the marketplace, or the agora, there was a gate that led out to the harbor, and many goods were shipped both to and from the city of Ephesus, including marble and fruit and vegetables, as well as wool. So it was a great commercial port.
Ephesus bustled with life, sited as it was at a crossroads between civilizations and belief systems. It had huge public buildings, an enormous theater, a library, and a temple. The Temple of Artemis of Ephesus, considered to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was one of the largest cities in the world.
Ephesus was the most important city in the province of Asia during the time of the early church. Because of its strategic location, Ephesus was a perfect place for the gospel to go forth.
It was precisely because of this that the Apostle Paul settled in Ephesus during the period of his missionary journeys.
Well, Paul is really the apostle who lays the foundation of the gospel in the province of Asia.
Paul arrived in Ephesus around 52 AD, and he chose Ephesus as his missionary base. That was his strategy, to pick large cities.
He stayed here for 3 years. Acts chapter 19 recounts that period in detail. We will see how, through Paul, the gospel had a profound impact on this area. The first leg of my journey will give me an important clue about Paul's time here. I find myself in front of the emblematic facade of the Library of Celsus. The impressive building dates from 117 AD. Over half of the fragments of the original were found, and it has been beautifully restored.
The library is known as the third largest library in the ancient world, after that of Alexandria and Pergamum.
It housed more than 12,000 scrolls lodged in recesses embedded in its walls.
At the time, it was the only place where you could read something. People did not have a private library, so it was open to the public, and people came to read the documents on site.
As I climb the steps of the library, an important symbol catches my eye. A 7-branched candelabra called a menorah. This is clear proof that there was a Jewish community in Ephesus. Thanks to the book of Acts, we know that as a Jew, Paul would speak in synagogues when on his missionary journeys.
He begins in the synagogue, which he does in many cities where there is a Jewish population. We know in Ephesus there was a substantial Jewish community.
The method of evangelization is always the same. His first step when he arrives in a new city is to go to the synagogue of the place.
Paul entered the synagogue and spoke boldly there for 3 months, arguing persuasively about the kingdom of God. But some of them became obstinate. They refused to believe, so Paul left them. He had discussions daily in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. This went on for 2 years, so that all the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord.
In general, this goes pretty badly after a while. So Paul is forced to leave the synagogue and create a structure next door, which is going to be the church.
This is where Paul will spread his message, his teaching, and that he will distinguish himself from the synagogue.
He would work as a leather worker in the market in the morning, which was the typical day in a Greco-Roman city. And then in the afternoon, business would shut down. People would go to the Roman baths. They would rest. But Paul now would be speaking in the afternoon in the hall of Tyrannus to people he had contacted through his work in the marketplace. And they would gather there and he would preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to them.
People of all walks of life would come and listen to the apostle preaching the resurrected Christ. For around 3 years, Paul went all out, often preaching late into the night.
Paul remained in Ephesus preaching the gospel. He did many miracles during this time. He did exorcisms, and all of this is described in Acts chapter 19. And so he had great favor with the community there. And during his time in Ephesus, the gospel radiated out throughout the province of Asia.
Many were convinced by Paul's preaching to the extent that it caused uproar among those who worshipped Artemis. For as we know, when Paul was there, Ephesus was a hub of paganism and the occult. Many Greek and Roman gods were venerated, but the main goddess of the city was Artemis of Ephesus, to whom a huge sanctuary was dedicated. You only need to visit Selçuk Museum a few steps away to understand the scale of devotion to Artemis at the time. The huge marble statue has been preserved and we can see it on show in a room set aside for it. The statue is a masterpiece, nearly 9.5 feet tall. Artemis, or Diana, her Roman name, was the goddess of the wilderness and hunting.
The cult of Artemis was the cult of a fertility goddess. The Artemisium, the temple of Artemis, is very famous throughout the Eastern Mediterranean.
The goddess is depicted in tight-fitting attire decorated with many species of animals representing fertility. Her chest is covered with protrusions open to various interpretations. Breasts or bull testes, different theories abound.
These are representations of statues with lots of breasts all over the body. It sounds curious, but it's a kind of paroxysm of the highest point of what is a cult of fertility.
Small miniature reproductions of the temple facade and the statue of Artemis have been found almost throughout all of the Mediterranean basin.
So many people traveled to Ephesus, of course, for the special services related to the Temple of Artemis. So those who are devotees or worshipers of Artemis would come to her festivals on an annual basis.
It is therefore a place of pilgrimage that attracts pilgrims from the whole empire. And they left with these small terracotta reproductions.
We need to understand that more than anything, worship of Artemis was a lucrative business. The sale of statuettes of the goddess was an important way of bringing finances into the city. It is my turn to buy a little statue as a souvenir. It would seem that not much has changed in 2,000 years. And now I make my way to the Temple of Artemis. It is here in the marshland outside the city that we find the remains of the fourth of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. What was a temple of huge importance to the people of the time is no longer impressive. It is difficult to imagine this today, but the temple was 4 times the size of the Parthenon in Athens. The sanctuary was over 150 yards long and 77 yards wide, with 127 marble columns, each nearly 22 yards high. There was no larger monument in the whole of ancient Greece. It was one of the first banks in the world. You could deposit money and even withdraw it with interest.
The cult of Artemis it was practiced in Ephesus as more than just a religious dimension. It was also a banking center. Important laws were posted around the temple. It owned a lot of property and brought in an income from the property held in the area.
The whole city lived in the shadow of the Temple of Artemis. To affirm the sovereignty of the goddess in the city, the Ephesians decided to have a sacred flame burning that should never go out.
The fire that we see especially is in the building in the upper city in Ephesus called the Prytaneum, where the eternal flame would be in the civic area.
The priests responsible for its care risked being burned alive should the fire go out. There were hundreds of priests, eunuchs, musicians, custodians, and magicians who initiated followers into secret rituals, offered sacrifices, and paraded in huge mystical processions in honor of Artemis. These were similar to those organized by other secretive religions practiced in the Roman Empire. It was the most visited temple in the whole of Asia Minor. A whole month of the year was dedicated to the goddess and given over to her bacchanalian revelry to celebrate Artemis of Ephesus. Pilgrims from all over the Greek world would attend orgastic festivals and initiation rituals in her honor. It was against this pagan backdrop that the Apostle Paul began to preach the gospel. Nowadays, it is not pilgrims coming to worship Artemis who flood the city, but tourists visiting the site in their thousands every day. As I make my way through them, I'm aware of the opportunity this gave Paul. He used the Temple of Artemis to his advantage. He preached the gospel to pilgrims from all over the empire who came to celebrate feasts in honor of the goddess Artemis. This caused Jews and pagans to gradually convert to Christianity.
The goddess of Artemis in Ephesus bumps into Paul, who comes to preach faith in Jesus Christ. So obviously the difference between these two types of beliefs and the two purposes is still quite strong. So Paul preaches to different backgrounds that come from extremely different cultures. So Paul is confronting others in his preaching with this revolutionary idea of the resurrection of bodies. And it's going to shock some people who do not believe in the resurrection of the body.
Challenge that the kingdom of God is presenting was very disturbing to certain people who had power, whether it's in the synagogue, whether it's in the city, whether it's in the other religious orders of that day. And the message of the gospel is bringing a different ethical standard. The treatment of slaves, for example, that Paul is talking about, of loving one another, preferring one another. Just the use of money that Paul is teaching in terms of stewardship. All of these elements of the gospel were very different than the cultural and political milieu of Asia Minor at this time.
Seeing the power behind Paul's miracles, a number of people who had been involved in witchcraft brought their scrolls and burned them publicly.
There had been an extraordinary awakening where there were setups of life. So much so that the occult arts present at Ephesus had been abandoned.
The book of Acts talks about the books being worth 50,000 drachmas, a fortune equivalent to millions of dollars today. But Paul had already convinced a large group of people to change their allegiance by saying that man-made gods were not gods but idols. He had such success that the number of pilgrims going to the temple decreased.
It is obvious that Christianity takes full brunt of the pagan cults, which are associated with an important mercantilism. There is a whole sacred trade that takes place around this city.
Those who had the most to fear from disdain for the worship of Artemis were the traders, craftsmen, silversmiths, and goldsmiths.
The silversmiths who are selling their souvenirs to the pilgrims who come into the city are upset because of the preaching of Paul, as he is saying there is only one God now. And of course, they're losing business. They're losing sales to these pilgrims who are coming in. And so they use the occasion now to bring opposition against Paul and to accuse him then of demeaning the status of Artemis.
The Acts of the Apostles in chapter 19 recount, in an absolutely incredible episode, the summoning by Demetrius of his colleagues in the congregation of goldsmiths.
Demetrius, a key leader of this group, called the craftsmen together to stir them up against Paul. Thus he became the spokesman for this large-scale protest movement, which spilled over into the whole city.
He realized that after a few years his trade was failing, and he made Paul and the Christians absolutely responsible.
And so they use the occasion now to bring opposition against Paul and to accuse him then of demeaning the status of Artemis. And as a result, the riot takes place and this large crowd goes into the theater that's quite close to the close to the commercial agora there.
The semicircular theater could hold 25,000 people. So, in the midst of utter confusion, these people came together to listen to Demetrius' speech. He easily succeeded in convincing the crowd, who then became unanimous in their defense of the goddess Artemis.
And we have now this mob for 2 hours shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians."
The riot was suddenly directed against Christians and Jews, as the Ephesians did not make any distinction between these two belief systems. Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but his companions discouraged him to prevent him being attacked by supporters of Artemis. The issue was resolved when the city clerk arrived, calmed the crowd, and reminded the Ephesians that this riot was a threat to Roman public order.
In Ephesus, there was one very important thing. The city had the title of City near Colossus, a city that had a temple. So an officer arrives during this revolt in the theater, and he told the people to shut up, to stop this revolt. If they continue like this, we're going to lose our title. If you have a problem with Paul, you can go to the judge, there are courts, and then elsewhere, but not here in this theater.
There was no justification for this gathering. So the city clerk dismissed everyone, asking the troublemakers to complain to the governor and take legal recourse against Paul. The crowd calmed down and dispersed. Because of this opposition, Paul had to leave the city and decided to set off for Greece to continue his missionary work there. But Demetrius was right. Christianity did undermine the goddess who had been so venerated across Asia. For Ephesus and its temple, this marked the beginning of a long decline and gradual dwindling in interest. The port of Ephesus was in a lagoon which gradually silted up, depriving it of its vital access to the sea and the source of its prosperity. So the city lost its prestige. Ephesus never recovered and was eventually completely abandoned over the ensuing centuries. But let's get back to Revelation. In the same way that the Ephesians abandoned this prestigious city, in the letter to the church in Ephesus, John the Apostle draws a parallel, noting that the church is in decline and has abandoned its first love. And yet all the church's history reveals that it had started out so well. So what had happened for it to lose its love for the Lord?
The Church of Ephesus is in a way the type of evolution of a church that started well and ends badly. She therefore abandoned her first love, not that the Church of Ephesus fell into idolatry, but simply because the multiplication of activities, works, etc., cut them off from the essential, that is to say, the communion with the Lord.
We don't necessarily have to see an unresponsive church. It may be a church that is still very active, but has forgotten why it had to be active.
One senses that Jesus himself regrets so much that the affection of this church for him has diminished. He says, "You don't love me like you used to." Finally, the consequence of this lack of love for the Lord is a consequence which carries its logical course. Since you move away from me, you lose the blessing.
The issue of this "you lost your first love" is not first of all a criticism of are you more on the merits or the form. It's just a thing to say, but what is the soul of your action?
Not far from Ephesus, in the northern suburbs of the city, stands an ancient Byzantine basilia. It is St. John's Basilia, built over the tomb of the Apostle. If Apostle Paul laid the foundations of the gospel in Ephesus, Apostle John was his successor.
Well, the traditions relate that John was released from exile here on the island and returned to Ephesus, and he lived out the rest of his days there. Ephesus was really the apostolic center because it's also the political center of the province. So this would be the natural place for John to live and to, in a sense, take over the work of the Apostle Paul in the province and continue to lead the churches in the province of Asia.
It was here that towards the end of the first century, John, who was very old by now, took care of the churches in Asia, to whom the book of Revelation is addressed. There is still an ancient baptistry here, witness to the long-forgotten era when new converts were still being baptized. The tomb is in the center of the basilia's nave.
In its initial phase, it was a simple tomb that was in a necropolis or cemetery there in the area. And the local Christians maintained the traditions that John was buried here. We see this tradition very early arising, and we see Christian pilgrims coming very early to visit Ephesus and to see the tomb of John.
John was bishop to the 7 churches in Asia Minor that he knew well, so he had the requisite authority to deliver this sort of message from Christ to the congregation in Ephesus.
Jesus is wanting this church then to be a model for all the other churches in the province of Asia. And because of their loss now of this love, they're falling short of his expectations. And so he's really challenging them to come back to that height to which He's called them to do. And
Therefore, the Lord is looking for a new encounter with the people of this church that marked this awakening that is described to us in the books of Acts. By the time Paul arrives at Ephesus, may once again become a present reality.
No doubt this echoes the situation of Ephesus, but it is also done on purpose. The author really wants to tell us the most important, the key from the very beginning, is this question of love. We are talking about a church that has perseverance, discernment, that does many things. But is she going to lose the heart, the soul of all of this? The living relationship with this God who loves her, who saved her. He gives us His Spirit. And so that's really the challenge, to say, is this still a relationship? And that is what threatens us. We see how in a believer's life, and even a committed believer, it is easy to start talking about God and stop talking to God.
I climbed the steps of the theater of Ephesus one last time. I have discovered here that despite a hostile environment, the gospel revolutionized the lives of inhabitants here over several decades. But its influence finally tapered off and virtually disappeared, leaving mere vestiges like this city. However, the church in Ephesus did still pave the way for the incredible growth of Christianity in the Roman world. The disruption brought here by the gospel was just a foretaste of the major political upheaval that the fledgling Christian church would have to face. All-powerful imperial Rome would aggressively oppose this new sect that had broken away from Judaism. Thus ends the letter to Ephesus and begins the letter to Smyrna,